Okay, I've tried to do my best for RFK Jr. I've tried to create a balanced picture here, but I cannot defend the behavior of moving her grave over, especially after they had the spectacular funeral where everybody could see that he really cared about her. Despite all the terrible things that she had done to him, he still cared about her, who she was. But then in the dead of night, to dig up the grave without the permits and to move it to some random place, and then to be like, well, I just didn't know that the plot was so cluttered. Well, you guys managed to bury the body, so what's the problem? It's not like you showed up to the place and were like, oh crap, there's no more room here for Mary. Well, I guess we're gonna have to go with plan B. That sucks. No, you managed to bury her, so what's the problem now? Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Chair Denise. Today we're going to finish Ask Not. This story has been a long time coming, but I feel like it falls really well here at the very end, especially since we just got done talking about Martha Moxley. And this story today is about Mary Richardson Kennedy, who was married to RFK Jr. And his name was mentioned quite a few times in the last episode, where we discussed his desire to absolve his cousin of these murder accusations. And so we talked a little bit about him, not a lot. Now, I will say that this book goes to no lengths to do any favors for RFK Jr. and his reputation. Lots of people who were upset. I got a lot of messages, people who were upset that I was even doing this book in the first place, saying that I was helping to be a cudgel against RFK Jr. and his, run for president. I hardly think that a book by a Daily Mail journalist is going to be the nail in his coffin, or was the nail in his coffin. But stranger things have happened, so potentially this could have been damning for him. I think this book, on the whole, is not credible enough to be damning for really anybody. I think that it's a juicy read. It came out during the summer for a reason, because it is a beach read. But it skims the surface like a stone going over the ocean. It is not in depth whatsoever. But with that being said, it's very, very ugly against RFK Jr. in this particular chapter. And I dragged my feet on it because I think there's no room for redemption for him in this chapter. He comes across as a terrible, terrible person. And I don't believe that he is the same person now as he maybe was when he was younger. And I feel like somebody who has openly spoken about his troubles and his issues in the past, both with fidelity and then also with drugs, alcohol, and just generally abusive to himself and to others. He's come out and he's admitted that's who he was. He's also come out and worked hard to not be that person. I feel like he may be one of the only Kennedys who's done that. And I also feel like this is a person who has repeatedly gone against the grain because he believed in it. And whether I always agree with RFK Jr. or not, I do really respect the fact that he is his own man and his family has derided him. His own wife now does not support whatsoever what he's doing in his alignment with Trump for the good of the American people. I don't think he would himself have wanted to align himself with Trump, but his goals and his ambitions for the health of America is such that he is willing to make amends with the fact that he doesn't love this candidate, but he would love to be able to help the American people. And for that, I have no problems. We do need to become a healthier country. But anyway, we're kind of meandering into politics. All this to say, I don't like the fact that this book does not allow for his story of redemption when I feel like it's a very public one, and one in which he has owned his faults, which very few politicians ever do. And I feel like it's disingenuous to write a whole chapter on somebody and how abusive they were of his wife and never include anything about the fact that he has openly discussed the fact that he was not a good person for many years of his life and that he is trying to do better now. We have to allow people to do better. And I think what's so strange to me is that Maureen Callahan I've listened to her in enough interviews where it would appear that she doesn't go for this idea that somebody needs to be cudgeled to death because of one specific time in their lives. It would seem that she would support the idea of a redemptive arc, but not in this book. And while we are talking about all these Kennedys and what terrible men they were, and it was just part of the family culture to treat women like trash, to then exclude the fact that, yes, but one of them has come out and denounced that behavior. Why would you leave that part of the story out? Do you want them to just be a brood of vipers? Or is there any room for change? Is there any room for redemption? Isn't that a beautiful story, that if he came from a family in which abuse was the norm, for him to fight against that? Isn't that what we're always saying, that we want it to stop with us, and like we want to be a better generation of people, and like let's not be like our parents? Well, if he's trying to be that, couldn't we write that story too? That's one side of the coin. Then the other side of the coin is, obviously, somebody could always argue, oh, he's just learned to play the system. He just knows that we now live in a time when the Kennedys aren't loved and admired and cherished, and their reputations are constantly padded and made sure that nobody thinks anything bad about him. Maybe he just realizes now that in order to get ahead, he has to admit at least some of the wrongs, and that's his play. Like, maybe he's as deceptive as the next one. Maybe he's just learned what this generation of Americans need their Kennedys to say. So there's that as well. I don't know. I'm just going to read this story to you. Let's go ahead and read this, and you guys let me know what you think about the way she discusses this individual. Because like so many of the women in this book, there's the version of the story in which they are being completely castigated and treated terribly by their spouses. And yet, these women have significant issues of their own, but we're just supposed to brush past it because, well, they're women. And really, how can they rise above when their man is treating them like this? I just feel like, where's our personal agency? I don't need to be limited to the way my husband treats me. Then I've lost all agency. Of course I had to hit the bottle. Of course I had to be frustrated with my kids. Of course I had to act a fool in public because my man was being mean to me. I'm not saying that there aren't terrible, terrible, terrible situations in which you're being horribly abused in your home and, you just snap and whatever. Okay, I get it. But to completely write off all of these issues as, well, it's because they were married to a Kennedy. How would you act? How would you feel? No. We all have personal agencies. Okay, it begins by saying all her life she had wanted only one thing, to be a Kennedy. Mary Richardson had been starstruck by the whole family, but no one more so than Robert F. Kennedy Jr., son of the martyred Bobby Kennedy and nephew of the late JFK. Bobby was an alpha Kennedy, and she had won him. For a time, anyway. The gorgeous, smart, talented Mary Richardson Kennedy, mother of 4, married to the most famous Kennedy man aside from JFK Jr., living in a $1 million house that she'd redesigned in the wealthy suburb of Bedford, New York, a woman everyone wanted at their charity galas and dinner parties, was now on the verge of losing everything. With her thick, dark hair, large brown eyes, and perfect pale skin, Mary was the Kennedy wife who, more than any other, evoked Jackie Kennedy. She worked hard at it. Her husband, after all, had been counseled by the family to find a wife like Jackie, a wife who could get him to the White House. She never really knew Jackie, who died 1 month after she and Bobby were married, but Mary, like Jackie, a highly visual person, emulated the former First Lady's style and affect. She wore preppy tennis sweaters during the day and minimal black shift dresses at night. She spoke in a similar manner, using a synthetic accent that sounded Long Island by way of London. She was as comfortable talking to presidents as she was to the PTA members. She was more charismatic, more coherent than her husband, especially when speaking in public. She was even good on television, as she had proven in 2008 when PBS star Bob Villa brought a camera crew to tour the family home in Westchester. Mary, an architectural designer, had gutted and redone the entire house after discovering mold on all 3 floors. Her work was masterful. She had turned a basic old Georgian colonial into a cutting-edge green home. As they were being interviewed, Mary displayed her original renderings while Bobby sat back in his chair, arms crossed, frowning. It didn't matter. Villa was more interested in talking to her. "Mary," Villa said, "you have had a huge job here because part of that job was breaking the news to your family that the house had become a sick house." A sick house. It was still, even though the mold was gone. Only the people who lived there knew it. Now, 3 years after that triumph, she could barely get out of bed. On the days when she summoned enough energy to take the kids to school, Mary was often in ratty pajama bottoms, her hair unkempt. "You have to pull yourself together," the other moms told her. "You're a Kennedy. You can't go around looking like this." In those moments, Mary would think, none of you could do what I do. None of you could hack being a Kennedy wife. It was something Mary had in common with Carolyn Bessette, married to Bobby's cousin John Jr. Almost every day, Mary dealt with the assumption that came not just from other women, but also from tabloids and esteemed historians, that being a Kennedy wife, especially the wife of the namesake, the eldest son of a beloved martyred leader, meant that you were special. It was never the other way around, that you'd chosen him, that you'd chosen this, that behind the scenes you were the brains, the mover, the shaker, the one who got things done. If you failed in any way, everyone, including your husband, would let you know, their contempt sometimes hidden, but mostly not. Look at the world I brought you into, the wealth, the fame, and admiration handed to you on this family's silver platter. How hard could it be? As Carolyn said every time her husband asked her that very question, I didn't get the effing employee handbook. It was cutting and true. Kennedy men tended to treat their women as afterthoughts. Even the adored John Jr. could be guilty of this. He was hardly like his father and deserved credit for that. He took his marriage seriously and, as he said at the outset, had every intention of being faithful. But he and Bobby Jr. had that male Kennedy entitlement, the expectation that their wives should be mind readers, hostesses who could throw together a dinner for 12 at the last minute, the uncomplaining cool girl. If her husband didn't come home when he said he would, if he was an hour or a day or a week late, the good Kennedy wife just brushed that off. And of course, a wandering eye, Bobby's wandering eye, was just part of the deal. Congenital, generational, baked in. The original recipe Kennedy. Okay, let's just have a little chat, shall we? I think that marrying a young RFK Jr. was probably very difficult because let's consider his upbringing with Ethel Kennedy. Quite frankly, if I do another Kennedy book, it will be on Ethel Kennedy. So if you know of any, let me know, because I won't probably cover any more Kennedy material for a minute. But if I find a good one on Ethel, that's what we're going to be reading after, of course, Tom Bower's book on the Beckhams. But Ethel Kennedy is a huge question mark because she was such a terrible mother. Absolutely terrible. Abusive, crazy. And we need to talk about Ethel because this book never got around to it. But when you consider the fact that RFK Jr. was raised in a house that was absolute chaos all the time and was basically allowed to do what he wanted and was shoved in boarding schools and, under the Kennedy name in which you really could get away with quite a bit, you have to believe that he was probably quite a handful to be married to at the beginning. Before he did any journeys of enlightenment, I think that being married to somebody like that would have had its significant challenges. So I don't want to pretend like, oh yeah, well, the person that we see now who, can sit there and talk calmly and rationally about things and who seems to have a lot of good answers for things and who seems to be fair and above board on a lot of different things. Well, that's who he is now. He's a much older gentleman, and so many men mellow out. The guy that she married, who she thought was going to drag her up into this beautiful Kennedy Camelot, I don't believe that person existed in his younger state. I certainly do not think that this person that we see now was always there, that he's a static character who has always been a good person and that, he was maligned. I don't think he'd say that. I think he was a terrible person when he was younger, and I'm willing to admit that. I just feel like I don't think this book ever gets to the part of any redemption. But anyway, let's keep going. For all the comparisons she drew to Jackie, Mary was really most like Carolyn. Oh, that's not good because I think Carolyn had some problems. Both were from upper middle class Catholic East Coast families. Both had worked in creative fields. Mary at the famed Parrish Hadley design firm, Carolyn as a top advisor to Calvin Klein, and both were haunts of the downtown New York scene. Mary running with the Warhol crowd, and Carolyn with actors and models at exclusive 12-seat Soho nightclubs. Both had far more edge than their husbands, more style. They were cooler and smarter and quicker, though everyone told them that they were the lucky ones. They were the ones who had married up. Not so. Mary and Carolyn gave their husbands a sharper eye, a sense of the new and modern. Both women, like Jackie before them, introduced their men to beauty for beauty's sake. They shared a high emotional intelligence and their own streak of danger. It was never a good idea to be around either Mary or Carolyn when one of them was angry. Their explosive rages, often coming out of nowhere, could be terrifying. There were times when Mary hit Bobby hard, punched him in the face. She'd pushed him down the stairs once. But he'd always come back to her. Their relationship hadn't always been this abusive. Mary was still deeply in love with Bobby. Sometimes she'd say that she was addicted to him and the alcoholic in her meant it. They had met when she was 14 and he was 21. Oh, wait. What? 14 and 21. I don't like the sound of those numbers. And though she'd gone on to have a great romance with the heir to a Greek shipping tycoon, a man Bobby knew well, and another with the son of a famous novelist, neither stood a chance against the Kennedys. Long before Mary and Bobby ever met, Mary had befriended his younger sister Carrie at Putney, a progressive boarding school in Vermont. There, they were roommates and quickly became best friends. Soon, she was subsumed into life at Hickory Hill, the Virginia base for the Robert F. Kennedys, spending weekends and holidays there, going on vacations with them, volunteering to work for any Kennedy sibling who needed help. This was a tight clan that brooked very few outsiders, but they'd welcomed Mary. Brilliant, suffering, complicated, charismatic Mary, whose own home life in New Jersey had been upended by her father's unexpected death when she was young. Here, she was in the bosom of America's first family, themselves no strangers to grief. She never wanted to leave. Bobby's mother, Ethel, called Mary her fifth daughter. Carrie became another sister to her. But Bobby, beautiful, long-haired, wild Bobby, well, her feelings for him weren't familial. He was only 5 years older than she was, but at 17 he may as well have been an adult. Girls fought over him. Boys wanted to be him. When he married his fellow law student Emily Black in 1982, Mary resigned herself. Bobby would never be hers. Okay, so maybe I shouldn't have overreacted quite so much when it said she was 14, he was 21. Okay, well, it didn't say he made a pass at her or anything, so I'm sorry about my overreaction. I should have continued reading. Okay, so that's on me. Anyway, one night in an art gallery in Manhattan, it was as if Bobby truly saw Mary for the first time. It was 1993. Bobby was a father now with 2 children, both under 10, a boy and a girl. He was recently divorced from Emily, he said. Would it have mattered if Mary knew he was lying? That he and Emily were not, in fact, divorced? Would it have mattered if Mary knew Emily's side? That Emily loved Bobby and had stuck with him through his heroin addiction, his overdose and arrest, the rehab stint in New Jersey, the serious health issues to follow, the 5-month-long hospitalization? That in 1992, after 10 years of marriage and 2 children, Emily and Bobby had separated over none of those issues, but over his constant infidelities? Probably not. Mary had always been in love with the Kennedys. Now she had the chance to be one. She had liked JFK Jr., but there had been no real interest on his side. Besides, JFK Jr. was kind of square, in her opinion. Dull. There was nothing dull about Bobby, and there was nothing cynical about their romance. They found solace in each other, these fatherless children who had struggled so, Bobby with drugs and, as Mary would learn, with an absentee, often rageful mother. We gotta read about Ethel. We have to. Soon Mary would realize all too well that the family she so idolized had its own secrets, and that Bobby wasn't exactly the favored son. He'd been kicked out of famous boarding schools and fobbed off to Lem Billings, his Uncle Jack's best friend, himself so desperate for proximity that he used drugs with Bobby Jr. This namesake son spent his formative years fairly crying out for maternal attention. But nothing could rally Ethel. Not his alcoholism, not his heroin use, not his expulsion from boarding school because his friends feared he was one overdose away from dying. Not even the incident where he spat ice cream in the face of a cop on Cape Cod, ground zero for the Kennedys, could compel Ethel to pay any attention to her very troubled son. On the other hand, all Mary wanted to do was pay attention to Bobby. In her way, she understood him. Bobby Jr. was 9 when his father died. She was 12 when her father went into the hospital with colon cancer. His death after surgery was a shock. He was only 57. Like Bobby Jr., she never had the chance to say goodbye. Mary's mother vanished into her own grief, and Mary developed an eating disorder. She was haunted by feelings of abandonment and low self-esteem. She drank and used drugs too, and when she was 22, her anorexia became so severe that she wound up in Boston's famed McLean Hospital for 3 months. I continually get hits for discussing difficult personal problems, but let's just say that she had ideations and made attempts at the ages of 25 and at 26. In Bobby, Mary had found that most elusive partner, someone who needed help and someone he could possibly save. Or maybe they could save each other. Okay, so I can understand why they both found themselves with each other. She had been a family friend. She'd always been around anyway. And he was probably looking for something that felt marginally familiar and safe, and somebody who he felt, maybe understood his family a little bit better. And, I can understand why they were brought together, especially because they both had, deep wounds as children regarding the death of their father. So, okay, we all understand this. I do, however, feel like if you'd spend vacations and holidays with the Kennedy family at Hickory Hill, You cannot say that you were completely blinded to the fact that this was not a family that functioned especially well under the maternal care of Ethel. You know, if this mother was as dysfunctional as we have been led to believe by the little scraps we've been able to collect from this book that never talks about her, of course Mary had to have known something was a little off with the clan, right? How can she have possibly been like, well, I got into a relationship with him and then I realized that Ethel was a really bad mom and probably had caused a lot of problems for the kids? Okay, well, their courtship was heady and fast, not the advisable thing for two people newly sober and working their steps in AA. Within months, Bobby had whisked Mary off to Ireland and she got pregnant. He proposed right away, and that was when Mary learned the truth, that Bobby and Emily were still married. Well, she didn't care. She was that much in love. Well, she probably didn't care because she probably knew. You know, like, you're going to tell me that there was nobody in their circle of friends who didn't come up to her and be like, hey, I know that he keeps telling you they're divorced, but actually they're not. They're separated. So, just FYI. Nobody ever said anything to her about that. She never looked into it. She never wondered what the deal was with the two of them. Yeah, she didn't care because she already knew. It wasn't like brand new information. Like Carolyn Bessette, her future cousin-in-law, Mary chose to ignore these blazing warning signs. Like Carolyn, she imbued her Kennedy man with all the qualities he lacked: self-awareness, humility, and intelligence. Wait a second. I don't think any of us are going to say that RFK Jr. is unintelligent. Some people may not like the way he uses his intellect and might feel like he is making judgment calls that they don't agree with. I don't think anybody would say he's an idiot. He is not JFK Jr., except Bobby Kennedy's little JFK Jr. Do you know what I mean? Like, I feel like we shouldn't act like, well, thank God he married Mary because otherwise he was an idiot. I don't think anybody can say that. But anyway, this author makes that conclusion because she says Mary was brilliant, always top of her class, a voracious reader, and a generator of ideas. Bobby, not so much. I don't know. I feel like Bobby wasn't an idiot. Years before his cousin John Jr. came up with the idea of mass-producing custom-made kayaks, Bobby, who was trying to carve out a career as an environmentalist with River Keeper, a nonprofit dedicated to protecting New York's Hudson River, wanted to sell bottled water branded with the foundation's name. That the bottles would likely be plastic didn't seem to matter to him. Maybe he was going to use recycled plastic. I mean, there's something there. Bobby was soon making enemies and embarrassing himself as a self-branded environmental expert. His book, The River Keepers, which he co-authored with John Cronin in 1997, was meant to burnish his reputation in a field relatively new to him. It had the opposite effect. James Gorman, deputy science editor of the New York Times, noted the book's multiple inaccuracies, including the assertion that DDT had eradicated entire bird populations. This is not a trivial mistake, Gorman wrote. The environment is Kennedy's claimed field of expertise, after all. And the DDT disaster is a famous one. Nor was Gorman impressed with Bobby's accounts of his addictions and recovery, or his tone-deaf hosanna to his Costa Rican nanny whose heavily accented versions of fairy tales and folk tales, Bobby wrote, inspired his environmentalism. Okay, you guys, I can't stop at every single passage, but I just don't really find it very offensive to say that his Costa Rican nanny, who had heavily accented versions of fairy tales and folk tales, inspired his environmentalism. Why is that offensive? Can he have liked her accent and found that the way she told stories was more interesting than, say, maybe his mother if she'd ever stopped to sit by his bed and tell him a word or two? You know, if he had said that he liked his Australian nanny's accent, nobody would have said boo. Everyone would be like, yeah, who doesn't like the Australian accent? You know? But because she's Costa Rican and her skin tone might be a slight more tan than his, we have to be offended that he liked her accent. Like, that doesn't even make logical sense. So a person who's going to come to those conclusions is very clearly reading with an overly critical eye to pick apart the material for why it's no good. Now, the DDT thing with the entire bird populations wiped out, okay, I don't know about that. I don't know all these things. And I'm not saying there weren't inaccuracies. And I'm not saying he wasn't trying to overstep his bounds as far as what he knew about the environmentalism as he tried to carve out a place for himself. But don't we have to do work in order to carve out a place for ourselves in any career that we try to take on? I mean, all of us are going to have some stops and fails at the beginning when we're trying to do a thing that we are new to. And I just feel like, he could have made inaccuracies and that's fine. We can call them out. But I don't think we need to decide that he's an idiot because some of the things that he said were inaccurate at the very beginning of the career that he was trying to take on. I'm not, by all means, let's correct the inaccuracies. Second edition of that book should have come out and they should have corrected their inaccuracies or, whatever the case may be. But to decide that, well, this guy's, out to lunch because he liked the accent of his Costa Rican nanny, what kind of a person would say that? I'm sorry, I'm not here for that kind of criticism. That's a stupid critique. But nothing could stop his ambition, his unerring belief that he was always in the right. Not even that bad review, in a newspaper that usually covered the Kennedys favorably, no less, gave Bobby Jr. pause. And Mary was proud of Bobby. Now, his divorce was quickie. It was obtained in the Dominican Republic, granted days before his and Emily's 12th wedding anniversary. Uncle Ted, the only other Kennedy man to divorce, suggested Bobby ask a close family friend down there, a priest named Father Jerry Creedon, to make it happen. Creedon had married Bobby and Emily, and what Mary knew of this didn't ruffle her. Emily was as unhappy as Bobby and wanted out just as much. Mary never truly sat with the big question. Why? What had made marriage to Bobby so unbearable? It was far easier to accept what other family members said. Emily didn't care for the responsibilities of being a Kennedy wife. Mary could. She was born for it. So 3 weeks later, in April 1994, Mary and Bobby were married on a simple boat in the Hudson River with no frills and no celebrities. A big life awaited her as a senator's wife, a governor's wife, and maybe someday first lady. She gave up her job, would have 3 more children, and 6 years after the wedding, Mary Kennedy found herself in $1 million house alone. Now, I just want to preface this all by saying, we know what happens to Mary Kennedy in the end, okay? YouTube doesn't want me to talk about it, but you and I, we know what happens. I understand completely that being married to Bobby was a nightmare at times, for sure. Emily could attest to that. I don't know why you don't have a chapter about Emily. Why don't we have a chapter about Emily? I'd like to know. That would have been another great chapter, because she's really the one who, was put through the paces with him. Is it because I don't know what Emily's story is. Is Emily supportive of RFK Jr. now? Is she not dripping with bitter condemnation for what he had done to her? Is she over it now? I don't know, but we should have gotten a chapter on Emily. If Emily's the one that was with him during his heroin addiction and during rehab and all these times when he's almost not here for this world anymore, Emily stood the test of time and then finally he left her, right? Well, where's our chapter on Emily? But now we have a chapter on Mary, who in the end sees herself out, if you know what I'm saying. And this was not the first time that she'd done this prior to meeting RFK Jr. So for this book to, and I can already feel it, trying to push us into the belief that, well, if it hadn't been for RFK Jr., Mary might still be with us. Well, can we know that though? Because prior to being married to him, she'd already attempted twice, and he wasn't in her life then. So how do we know this wasn't already the way she was predisposed to think, feel, and behave? That's just not my question. Okay. Again, I think he was riddled with problems. Womanizing being number one on that, right? Because he may have been done with his addictions to substance abuse and whatnot. But the women, that was his own addiction. And he didn't seem like he was interested in kicking that one to the curb, right? And who among us would want to be married to that? So I believe he was a nightmare. I believe he had real issues. And I bet you anything that he was really good at making you believe that the problems that you were dealing with were not his problems. They were all yours because you were crazy, right? I'm sure he was capable of that. One of the things that was difficult was that Bobby was never around, ever. He didn't have a job that required travel, yet he traveled all the time. It was like a compulsion. Some days he'd be in 3 different states, giving speeches or taking meetings, or really, she didn't know what he was doing. His packed schedule signaled status, but it was all a facade. Bobby gave paid speeches and appeared on television and hobnobbed with the elite, but he was prone to outlandish beliefs. He could be a snob, even within the family itself. It mattered so much to him whether Ted, more than any other aunt or uncle, liked their children and made time for them. It mattered whether John and Carolyn liked him. It mattered that he mattered to the A-list Kennedys. Mary understood. It mattered to her too. But the more her looks and smarts and elegance redounded to Bobby's benefit, the more he seemed to resent her. May I also say that it's not exactly outlandish for you to want your family to like you. I think that's kind of par for the course. And it just happens that so many of these Kennedys were famous people. But I don't know that it's necessarily him playing to the affirmation and attention of the famous Kennedys, because he was a famous Kennedy himself. So I think he had enough status of his own. But you want your family to like you, right? Surely. That's not a surprise or a shock to any of us. You want your family to like you. And I think that considering the fact that there was no maternal wing of his family to fall back on, Of course he wanted the members of his family to accept him. He can't go to his mother for love. She's cold and snake-like. But then you're going to go to the other members of the family. And are we shocked that he wanted Ted Kennedy? Okay. On the one hand, yeah, because Ted's a pig, so what do you care about Ted? But on the other hand, Ted had become sort of the surrogate dad for all of these Kennedy children. And so, and for him, the only male left to sort of look up to and to seek sort of that paternal validation would have been from Ted. And, you know, I think Ted was a terrible person in so many respects, but I don't necessarily blame RFK Jr. As a younger man looking to Ted, wanting Ted's blessing, because the whole myth and legend about Ted within your own family is that, you know, he's this great guy who's, you know, headed to the White House. You can be in your family and be high on your own supply of, you know, the myth and legend that surrounds you as a clan. Even though you're living in it and you know it's terrible, you can still believe that you guys are more than you are. All right, well, anyway, I got to stop all these asides. We got things to do. Now her husband would rather be anywhere but with her. And when he did swoop in, he'd take one or all of the children off on some adventure and leave Mary behind. She was never invited. Mary had somehow become a persona non grata, despite hosting all the dinner parties, the 4th of July barbecues, the fundraisers, the celebrity-studied games of Capture the Flag. Uninvited, despite writing all the thank you notes and the RSVPs, despite doing the day-to-day work of raising their children. Despite pretending not to notice when she'd see the look on another woman's face that said, "Oh my God, Mary, your husband is touching me under the table." Or, "I've slept with him, but it's in the past. It meant nothing." Or, "It's still going on, but let's all be adults about this." Mary didn't handle it well. You could say to yourself, well, who would? But of course there had been the dignified Jackie. There was Ethel. There was Rose. The question was never, why can't Bobby be faithful? The question was always, what's wrong with Mary? Okay, let's think about this. Okay, so like unacceptable behavior. Your husband does not need to be going and carrying on like that with all these other people, and you should not have to accept it. Not at all. On the one hand, you want to say, as far as him coming and taking the kids, if Mary was prone to these like extreme rages, I think it would be hard to be in a home like that. And maybe that's why he avoided being home, because of the rages. But then maybe he felt really guilty that he left the kids and her care when she was subject to these terrible rages. And maybe he took all the kids away so that they could get a break from her anger and her indignation and constant irritation. And maybe he didn't invite her because that was the whole point, to give the kids a break from being with her. On the other hand, you know, him taunting her and basically rubbing her face in all of his affairs, that is dysfunction at the highest level. You know, so if you want to protect your kids from the terrible rages of their mother, maybe don't do things that would incite a much-deserved terrible rage. Well, gaslit, that's how Mary felt. The more pain she was in, the worse Bobby treated her. Some days he wanted a divorce. Others, he wanted to bring another woman into their bed, an idea that left her humiliated. She rejected him outright. One day, Mary had a female friend over, and Bobby sauntered in right out of the shower and dropped his towel around his waist, exposing himself. Mary had long suspected he was cheating on her, but he would always deny it. He'd tell her she was crazy, and that she was the one destroying their marriage and driving him away. Was it any wonder he never wanted to be home? Then she found the diaries. Oh, the diaries. It was as if he was writing for posterity, for some future biographer. In Bobby's writings, Mary was either the perfect wife or an unhinged monster. There was no in-between in these pages, no nuanced portrait of his complicated, funny, observant wife, one who saw and understood far more than her husband knew. He accepted zero accountability for her anger. In fact, Bobby used it against her. He wrote, "Mary is being impossible. She refuses to do anything fun with me like snorkeling, and is deeply resentful when I do it myself." Okay, well, I mean, I can see both of their sides in this. Why would you want to be around your husband when you felt like he was always cheating on you? On the other hand, when he tried to bring her in to his world, she rejected him. So, of course, he was going to feel like he was entitled to do what he wanted because he'd invited her and she'd said no. So this is what I don't understand. Is he not inviting her on these trips, or is she saying, I don't want to go, and then he goes anyway, and then she decides that's her being, uninvited into the familial atmosphere? What is it? Did he invite her or didn't he? I can't tell from this. Well, anyway, she had been pregnant with their 4th child, and he wrote, "Mary's out of control. She's angry. She is angry now every day. She's not even remorseful, but is filled with venom and retribution." And another entry, Mary is continuing in her resolve to deal with anger and control. I am discovering the well of resentments that I have against her. Another entry, Mary on a rampage. She's really possessed by some terrible demon. Not once did Bobby link her rage to his constant cheating, which was all over these pages. Had he left those diaries somewhere that she was bound to find them? In the back pages of each book, under the heading Cash and Accounts, were lists of women, delineated by month, that Bobby had been with. He ranked them from 1 to 10, as if he was a teenager. 10, Mary knew, was for full-on intercourse. My lust demons, he wrote, were his greatest failing. He used the word mugged a lot. Women who, he wrote, just came up to him on the street and said, "How about it?" If they had sex, he considered himself mugged, a passive victim of aggressive women. There were so many, astronomical numbers, Mary said, and she knew a lot of them. The celebrated actresses who came to their house and went on vacations with her family, the older model who was always around, the socialite whose husband was one of Bobby's good friends, a gorgeous royal, the wife of a very famous man, a lawyer, a doctor, an environmental activist, all these beautiful, accomplished women. How could Mary compete? It wasn't just the womanizing. It was the way Bobby described being away from Mary as both respite and a constant battle to control his sex drive. The 30 days he spent in a maximum security Puerto Rican prison for protesting Navy exercises, he wrote, were among the happiest of his life. It was the summer of 2001, and Mary had just given birth to their 4th child. I'm content here, Bobby wrote of prison. I have to say it. There's no women. I'm happy. Everybody here seems happy. And it's not misogyny. It's the opposite. I love them too much. Not misogyny. Could have fooled Mary. To stay married to Bobby would be self-abnegation. To stay would be to grind herself down into a woman with no needs or wants, without dignity, without equality to the relationship. And even then, Bobby wouldn't be happy. He'd probably just have more contempt for her. But if they were to divorce, Mary would lose her entire identity, not just as a Kennedy, but as a person of importance. She had left the workforce when she married Bobby, and as their children grew older, she found herself with entire school days to fill. What would she be without the fundraisers and the Kennedy summers on the Cape? So she clung to him. And the harder she clung, the more he pulled away, and the more distraught she became, weeping and drinking and struggling to get out of bed, the harder he turned on her. In 2012, after nearly 20 years of marriage, Bobby said that he'd had enough and was moving out. Mary was nuts, Bobby said, mentally ill, in need of serious psychiatric help. Mary panicked. She worried that Bobby was beginning to lay the groundwork to set her up as an unfit mother. It was what Kennedy men did, turn on their women when they were done with them, call them crazy, dispose of them. And what would become of her? He'd taunt her with threats. I'll take the house. You're going to be poor. The Bobby Kennedy Jr.'s weren't nearly as well off as people assumed. Bobby had been one of 11 siblings, and the bulk of the father's money had been spent on the 1968 campaign for president. Bobby Jr. was augmenting his salary at the Riverkeeper Alliance with work as a law professor at Pace University. And he had his book deals and those speaking engagements, but none of it was enough to raise 4 children in the manner of senior Kennedys, let alone pay child support for the 2 children from his first marriage, or the gut renovation of their home. When Mary gave interviews about that project, a creative environmental triumph for her, she described the redone house as powered by geothermal energy, heat gathered from the earth. It was a metaphor for the home Mary had always wanted, a self-sustaining, deeply rooted ecosphere, warmth spreading from the bottom up, an ever-renewing source of comfort. She told Bob Villa that the decision to gut the home had been devastating for the children and for Bobby. To ease them through, Mary reframed it as a process of salvage. She was still trying. Mary, though, would come to hate that house. Bobby had managed to get most everything done for free, but it cost $40,000 per month to run and staff it. What was meant to be a private sanctuary had become a display case for fundraisers and events, and, ostensibly, their perfect family. When Bobby had a film he wanted to show about Earth Day, a project that was a real point of pride for him, Mary arranged for a big party at the house. A conversation with RFK Jr., she called it. Bobby would give a speech, and they'd show the movie, and he'd sign books, and he'd be in his glory. If only he had bothered to show up on time. If only he hadn't all but forgotten about it. All the work she'd done, all the luminaries and Kennedy admirers in their home. If only he had cared about how this would reflect on Mary. Those guests who knew her well could detect her anxiety. She was furtively looking at the door, then her watch, then the door again. When she finally got Bobby on the phone, he showed up and did what he did best. Glad-handing, accepting praise, pocketing money, ignoring his wife. It wasn't as if he were the only one to blame here. Even those close to Mary, much like those close to Carolyn Bessette, would admit that she could be difficult. Very, very difficult. Bobby was trying to rein in Mary's spending, her compulsive shopping, but she was trying to fill an emotional black hole with clothes, trips, private yoga sessions with a local teacher who was becoming one of her closest friends. That should have been a warning sign to Mary, that she was becoming so alienated from her actual friend group, from the social circle she usually moved in, that she'd come to rely on someone who provided paid services to her, with all the inequality that entitled. But Mary couldn't stand the idea of the Bedford moms or Bobby's other women, some of whom lived quite close by, knowing how undone she was. So it was the yoga instructor who, one spring day in March 2012, came by the house to find Mary alone in the dark, curled up on her window seat. Inconsolable. She seemed to have been crying for hours, just ugly crying. And in her anguish, Mary divulged Bobby's cheating. Her friend wasn't shocked. Everyone in Westchester knew about Bobby. The first time Mary's friend had met him at the house with Mary, she could tell Bobby was sizing her up, seeing if she might be receptive to a flirtation right then and there. Maybe more. Her friend shut down, refused to engage on that level. Had Mary seen it? Her friend had no idea. It wasn't just the cheating that had Mary so upset. She confided that after finding evidence of yet another affair, she'd become so hysterical, she'd run out of the house, gotten in her car, backed out of the driveway, and accidentally run over and killed Portia, the family dog. Oh no. Not running over the family dog in a fit of hysteria. Was she as bad and as hopeless as Bobby seemed to think? I don't think I can go on, she said. Yeah, see, that's bad. Not that she meant to run over the dog. If you were married to somebody who is constantly trying to frame everything you do as yet more evidence that you're an insane person, if you run out of the house super upset and you get in the car and you run over the dog, that is going to be really easy for him to twist and make you feel even worse about that. Because there's no way you don't already feel like the worst person in the world when you run over the family dog. You'll never recover from it. But what fertile ground for him to plant the seeds of her insanity. See, look at you. You're just running pell-mell down the driveway, running over the dog. This is the kind of person you are because you're so out of control of yourself. So if a person wanted to really use and abuse another person's emotional state, that would have been great fodder for it. Mary had been seeing a therapist in the city, sometimes alone and sometimes with Bobby. Her name was Sheena Hankin, and she specialized in high-profile patients. When Bobby asked for Mary to be diagnosed as mentally ill, Hankin refused. Bobby had already tried to institutionalize Mary, driving her, at first without her knowledge, to the psychiatric wing of a local hospital. When Mary realized where he was taking her, she jumped out of the car and Bobby followed. He tried to restrain her. Someone called the police. And when they showed up, Mary explained what was going on. Bobby argued he was afraid that Mary would harm herself, and the cop said, in sum and substance, "Take your wife home." "Your wife isn't mentally ill," Hankin told him. "She's angry and depressed and emotionally immature, but she's not ill. Do you have any idea what could be upsetting her?" Of course not. Hankin explained to Bobby that Mary likely suffered from borderline personality disorder, its origins Mary's deep fear of abandonment, probably stemming from her father's death when she was still a child. Mary's chronic spending, her constant insecurity and need for reassurance, her bouts of rage were all hallmarks. Mary had never really grown up, and latching on to the Kennedys so soon after her father died, becoming part of Bobby's family as a teenage girl, had left her profoundly vulnerable to him. Mary needed Bobby much more than he needed her. Her drinking, which was among Bobby's big complaints, was situational, Hankin said, another byproduct of being left alone so often for long stretches, by a husband who didn't come home when he said he would. Mary was trying to self-soothe, she explained, while punishing herself for not being the wife Bobby wanted. Hankin knew more about Bobby than she let on. She had another client, a woman who'd been at an event with Bobby and Mary, who'd said Bobby had come on to her very strongly. Yet another client, also a woman, had been seated next to Bobby on an airplane. They were strangers, but he'd come on to her too, and fast. This client had embarked on a brief affair with him, so Hankin knew well Mary's torment. When it was only Mary in session, Hankin tried to advise Mary. Gently but firmly, she would say, Mary, I don't think this is ever going to be the marriage you want. I don't think Bobby is ever going to be the husband you want. Really, Hankin was saying, get out. That's the thing. Both of them are so unhappy with each other, and both of them, I think, had legitimate grievances. I think Mary had a legitimate grievance when she said, hey, could you not screw every single woman that darkens our doorstep? That'd be awesome. Let's start there. I don't even see how you could maintain a relationship with somebody whose wandering eye was just darting back and forth so fast and furtively. What hope would you ever have of feeling safe and that this was a relationship that you could be fully invested in and that there was absolute trust in the relationship? Because there's not absolute trust. This person has all the care and attention of a rutting bull moose. You don't need to engage yourself with this individual. He can't even think straight because he is so addicted to women. Get out, at the same time, I can completely see why Bobby Kennedy was, had it up to here with all of her own individual problems. Being married to somebody with borderline personality disorder is not for the faint of heart. Let's all recall Amber Heard on the stand. Okay, that's the person who has personality disorder. Is that somebody that you feel like you could deal with? I feel like that's somebody I couldn't deal with. And I think that Bobby's frustration was legitimate. I think being married to Mary would have been extremely hard. But see, both of these people are adults who need to wake up to the fact that they just can't seem to manage a relationship. Instead of constantly trying to make it about the other person, why don't you just say, we don't work together? You've got the addiction to women. I have my personality disorders. Let's just part ways while we still have some sanity left. But I do understand why Mary didn't want to part ways, because really, what does she have if it's not for the Kennedy family? That was, like this book says, her only point of solace, having attached herself to them so early on after her father died. Well, it was the affair with an actress that tore Mary apart. Bobby had filed for divorce in May of 2010 and had moved into a nearby house in Mount Kisco, New York. Mary couldn't bring herself to accept that Bobby was really leaving. He was the son, the person she talked about all the time. Bobby this and Bobby that. Sometimes she wanted him back, and other times she reviled him. She told one friend that Bobby said the ugliest things to her, that she'd be, quote, better off dead, and that things would be so much easier if she would, finally just do it. He encouraged her to consider it as a viable way of finding some peace in life, for herself and for everyone else. I mean, if he really said that to her, my goodness. Now she was seeing pictures of Bobby with Cheryl Hines, the star of Curb Your Enthusiasm, in an age-appropriate match. When Hines was in New York, she was staying with Bobby and building relationships with their kids. No more parties at the Kennedy compound in Hyannis for Mary. No longer was she the fifth Kennedy daughter, as Ethel had called her all those years. And how could she consider Carrie her best friend now that Carrie was happily socializing with Bobby and Cheryl? Oh, the stab in the heart. So now you've lost your husband, but the family that you thought had brought you in as one of their own is now rejecting you completely. They could destroy me. Mary said this about the Kennedys more than once. She had found what she thought was even more proof of his womanizing. The names of over 40 women, some from Canada and Europe, stored in his cell phone. Not that it mattered. Cheryl, it became clear, wasn't going anywhere. And so Mary drank. So much that she got arrested twice for driving under the influence. Her mugshots made the news. The once refined Mary Richardson Kennedy, glassy-eyed with wild hair, in police custody. She was withdrawing from her everyday life, canceling her regular yoga classes. All but 2 of her friends had abandoned her. One accused Mary of being status conscious of her own children, using their first and last names in conversation so that people would know she was a Kennedy. It took Mary aback. People wouldn't have dared speak to her like that when she and Bobby were still together. Everyone knew what a mess she was. She could hear the other Westchester moms now. Poor Bobby. Look what he's had to put up with all these years. No wonder he strayed. Can you blame him? That Cheryl seems to have everything together. She works with Larry David. What a great couple. Well matched. There was a story about Bobby. After he'd filed for divorce from Mary in May of 2010, he had gone into the city for a deposition with her divorce lawyers. Someone brought in lunch, and when the day was over, Bobby got up and walked out of the door, leaving his leftovers and crumbs and dirty napkins for someone else to discard. The trash bin was 3 feet from where he'd been sitting. One of the lawyers in that deposition thought that it said everything about Bobby Kennedy Jr. Entitlement. Arrogance. His trash was something for the help to take out. And that was how Bobby was treating Mary now. Mary's divorce lawyer echoed Hankins' advice. Get out. It's not a good look not to throw your trash away, Bobby. If the trash can's right there, come on. But I also don't think that that's exactly a searing indictment against one's character because they did not throw their trash away. It's not a good look. It's pretty irresponsible, That's your trash. Those are your crumbs. That's your leftovers. Get rid of it. It's not even hard. Look how fast I did that, So, for sure, bad luck on Bobby, but I just don't feel like I would see that and be like, oh, well, look at him. Look at this entitlement. Look at this Kennedy entitlement. This kind of thing right here is why she needs to get out from that relationship. There's just so many bigger reasons why. I just feel like this book belittles its point when it says he didn't throw away his trash one time. So, that's all you need to know about his entitlement. Well, let's spend more time on all of these women that he was supposedly with. That's a real good reason to get out of that marriage. By April 2012, Cheryl was looking like the next Mrs. RFK Jr., and Carrie seemed all for it. She had posted a picture of Bobby, one arm around the actress Glenn Close and the other around Cheryl, taken at Glenn's birthday party. Mary had considered Glenn a dear friend, but for Carrie to share that on social media, that was thoughtless at best, cruel at worst. The day after that, on April 14th, Cheryl tweeted about dining at Mary's favorite haunt, a place she'd often taken her children. At Armbonk's Burgers and Shakes in Armonk, New York, Cheryl wrote, so good. Then there was the gala in California with Carrie tweeting pictures of Bobby and Cheryl with Jackson Brown, writing that the latter two, quote, were amazing on stage and off. It was as if they were all saying to Mary, good riddance, you don't belong anymore. You're not missed. Bobby was making ruthless moves now. He cut off Mary's credit card, court approved, for $20,000 a month in living expenses. She owed $32,000 to American Express and had a balance of $0 in her checking account. Her card was getting declined at the drugstore, the supermarket, even her child's doctor's office. She was reduced to asking other moms at the school run if they had an extra $20 so she could get gas and groceries. The whole town knew she was broke. Mary Kennedy, American royalty, had been dethroned. One evening long after that California gala with Cheryl and Jackson Brown, Carrie came by to visit Mary. It was May 14th, 2012, the day after Mother's Day. Whatever was said during that house call left Mary in tears. Okay, let's talk about this business of him cutting off her credit cards. What in the world? If it was court approved that he was supposed to give her $20,000 a month in living expenses, and then he just didn't do it, and he was okay with her literally having to beg the other moms in the carpool line for $20 to get gas and groceries, that's appalling behavior of the mother of your children. I don't care how upset you were at her, wrathful ways and her drinking and all of this. There's no reason to embarrass her like this. And she's taking care of your children with that money. How was he expecting that the children would be taken care of if he just cut her off when she doesn't have any money? There's $0 in her bank account. She owes money on her credit card. The credit card that you're supposed to provide funds for, I guess was it a debit card? I don't know. But there's supposed to be $20,000 a month that she can spend on that card. And then he's just sort of like, figure it out. How could she? She's not worked all her life. As soon as she married him, I'm not saying that she couldn't get another job. I'm not saying that, she needed to live on his generosity for the rest of her days. But what I am saying is that if the court appointed that this was to be done, how could he just not do it and then face no repercussions? But why, more importantly, why would he do it? Why did he feel it necessary to make her feel like nothing? He'd gotten away. He was now, living life with Cheryl Hines. Back to the text here. 2 days after the sister, Carrie, had come by for a visit and it all ended in tears, though we don't know what was said. 2 days later on Wednesday morning, Mary put on her yoga clothes and sandals, walked out to her barn, stacked 3 metal crates atop each other, then used a metal ladder. And when she was found that afternoon, Mary's fingers were stuck inside the rope because she changed her mind, but it was too late. The Kennedy machine kicked into overdrive. Lawrence Leamer, the famous Kennedy historian, was given access to Bobby's side of the story. It ran in Newsweek just 4 weeks later, a radiant Mary on the cover, one of her toddler boys in her arms, the headline reading, Behind the Mary Kennedy Tragedy. Kennedy is in bold font. Even the font size minimized her. This was a Kennedy story first, another family tragedy second. And Mary herself was something of a footnote. The story inside, of course, absolved Bobby of any responsibility. Here was the womanizing Bobby the story read, always described as the former heroin addict, leading his innocent wife to her death, yet another victim of an overweening male ego. And he did so while flaunting his affair with actress Cheryl Hines, who played Larry David's wife on Curb Your Enthusiasm. It's a juicy tale, lacking in nuance. But perhaps Bobby wasn't guilty. Perhaps nobody was guilty. Perhaps Mary Richardson Kennedy was, and has been for some time, a desperately sick woman. That's the portrait that emerges from a sealed 60-page court affidavit filed by Bobby during divorce proceedings, which I have reviewed in detail, and from interviews with those who were closest to Bobby and Mary, including medical professionals who treated her and said that she suffered from a psychiatric disorder. All of Mary's siblings, 4 sisters and 2 brothers, insisted that these claims were lies, that Mary's depression was a direct result of her husband's cheating and neglect, his threats to take the children and leave her with nothing, bringing the full weight of the Kennedy family to bear against her. Sheena Hankin hadn't said that Mary was mentally ill, nor had Mary's lawyer. Under circumstances like the ones Mary was under, she'd have to be crazy not to be depressed. 2 days after finding Mary, Bobby and Carrie gave an interview to the New York Times. They said Mary was a disconsolate alcoholic. They spoke of her arrests and her ideations. I feel like I've lost half my body, Carrie said, half my soul. A lot of times I don't know how she made it through the day, Bobby said. Mary's siblings had been aware of her lifelong battle with depression, and in 1997 her brother Thomas sought to assuage Bobby Jr.'s fears. I know you think Mary's going to... Thomas reportedly emailed Bobby in 1997, but I guarantee you that she won't do it. I may regret those words one day, but that's how I feel. Yet Bobby's siblings were infuriated by Bobby's talkativeness. There was no reason to defile her in death. There was no reason to give that sealed affidavit to a journalist, if not to save Bobby's reputation at the cost of Mary's. Her brother wanted to take Mary's remains and bury her in Westchester, but Bobby fought them. He wanted her buried in the Kennedy family plot in Massachusetts. He took the matter to a judge and brought along one of his teenage sons as support for his argument, and he won. And so there was a Kennedy funeral with famous people there, of course, such as Chelsea Handler and Julia Louis-Dreyfus and Susan Sarandon. Mary's siblings stayed away. Bobby and Carrie gave eulogies. 300 people listened as Carrie spoke of Mary's demons, of Mary having lost her fight. Carrie also talked to the media in the parking lot outside St. Patrick's Roman Catholic Church in Bedford, where the service was held. I just think about the story of Michael the Archangel, who had to battle the forces of evil and had to battle Satan, who was trying to enter paradise, Carrie said. And that's what Mary did her whole life. She was battling those demons and keeping them out of the paradise that was Mary. Stupid thing to say. In his eulogy, Bobby said that he would never feel about another human being the way he felt about Mary. Interesting. He said that Mary blamed him for taking her away from her profession to be a stay-at-home mom. I know I did everything I could to help her, he said. In Bobby's telling, in the church and in the press, the real victim here was Robert F. Kennedy Jr., enduring such a mental disturbed wife all those years, a depressive and a drunk who'd been hospitalized for anorexia as a young woman, who had had 2 previous attempts in her past, and who at a low point in their divorce was found passed out at the dinner table, face down on a plate of food. Wait. He said all of that in her eulogy? That she was found, that he'd done everything he could, and that what are you supposed to do with somebody who's passed out in a plate of food? Like, can this possibly be what he said? All of those things? Is there any way for us to get some kind of transcript of this speech that he gave? And what the heck? It's pretty telling if Mary has a funeral and none of her family members come. None of her brothers or sisters come to her funeral because they think that it's such a facade. And all of these people, all of these celebrities are there, and Mary's funeral is like this big A-list event. And they're giving eulogies about how, well, what can we do when somebody's a depressive and a drunk and has been hospitalized and had attempts in the past and whose face is in a plate of food half the time? What? It says here that in Bobby's telling, in the church and in the press. So some of this he said at the funeral. Some of this was just stuff that he talked about afterwards. Regardless, it seems like pretty evident that he was on the rampage to make sure that he got out the story that he needed. The funeral, though, that was elegant. The service ended with everyone singing America the Beautiful, a nod to all that the Kennedys have sacrificed for the nation and their unique and enduring suffering. Outside the church, Bobby blew kisses to the press and the crowds. Mary's casket was loaded into a hearse and driven 4 hours from Bedford, New York, up to the Kennedy plot in Centerville, Massachusetts. 65 mourners, including an aging Ted Kennedy, gathered at Mary's grave as the sun went down. Each of her children touched her coffin as Bobby looked on. Mary Richardson Kennedy was buried near Eunice Shriver, JFK's sister, given pride of place among the Kennedys, a public acknowledgement of her station. But 1 week later, in the middle of the night, without telling Mary's siblings or obtaining the required legal permitting, Bobby Kennedy Jr. had Mary's coffin dug up and moved 700 feet away. And reporters found out and asked why. Bobby, through family spokesperson Ken Sunshine, said, the grave, not her grave, another depersonalization, is now on a sunny hillside shaded by an oak tree with room for her children and other family. Bobby also said he failed to realize how crowded the Kennedy family plot was, a claim that strains credulity. Mary was left to face traffic, no headstone marking her grave, buried alone. And that is the end of Ask Not. Okay, I've tried to do my best for RFK Jr. I've tried to create a balanced picture here, but I cannot defend the behavior of moving her grave over, especially after they had this spectacular funeral where everybody could see that he really cared about her. right? And that, she was just a troubled person. Hands off. He had nothing to do with it. This was just a wild, wild thing that she decided to do. Sadly, they could have seen it coming since there had been so many attempts in the past, but he had nothing to do with it. She was a drunk, so what are you going to do? And to make sure that everybody saw that he had placed her right next to Eunice Shriver and right next to all the famous Kennedys, because, she was part of his family. Despite all the terrible things that she had done to him, he still cared about her, who she was. But then in the dead of night, to move the coffin, to dig up the grave without the permits, and to move it to some random place, and then to be like, well, I just didn't know that the plot was so cluttered. Well, you guys managed to bury the body, so what's the problem? It's not like you showed up to the place and you're like, oh crap, there's no room here for Mary. Well, I guess we're going to have to go with plan B. That sucks. No, you managed to bury her, so what's the problem now? You had the forethought to think about wanting her to be buried with all of her children one day in the future when everybody's dead and it doesn't matter where you're buried anyway. You had the forethought to think about that, but you didn't have the forethought to think, hey, I guess I should check the family plot and make sure there's room for Mary. Which, by the way, there was room for Mary because you did bury the body. So what's the crowding issue that you're discussing here? What are you talking about? I have to say that ended on a pretty bad note for RFK Jr., and I did my best. Now, I guess I will just say at the end of this that as much as I want to believe in the arc of redemption, that is fairly close to our present time that he was over here mucking around in the graveyard. So that's disturbing. And as I said at the top of the show, it is very possible that he's clever enough of a person to know what this generation wants their Kennedys to say. At the same time, if he can manage to do anything about the situation with our food and how we're all eating a bunch of chemicals and it's called food, I would really love for him to be able to manage that. So on the one hand, I will never give my stamp of approval to the way he's lived his life, because I don't think anyone can give their stamp of approval to that and be an honest broker. But if he can finagle some way for us not to eat chemicals, I would really love that. And that would be something that he could maybe do to redeem himself, because we're all dying at an unprecedented rate and we're all so fat, myself included. And I would like to be able to go to the grocery store and not buy chemicals. So there's that. But other than that, I have to say this was a pretty damning indictment on what's going on. And I understand that Maureen Callahan has no love for him. And I can tell by the way the story was written that she really, really, really milked certain passages to create question marks in her mind. I think the only thing you have to tell me to create a question mark in my mind is that he would, dig up a body in the middle of the night to move it after he'd just done a great big celebrity show to let everyone know how much he cared about Mary when he had been cheating on her low these many years and then had been rubbing her face in his new relationship with Cheryl Hines. I mean, you don't even really need to tell me any more than that. It makes me think pretty badly about this person. But I do believe in redemption, and I would like him to be a little bit more clear about what was happening with that grave situation. I don't think I've ever really heard him talk about that, but I also haven't been looking either. So maybe he's addressed it. Maybe he's got something better than the graveyard was crowded. Yeah, graveyards are pretty crowded. People die every day. Might be something you could have looked up pretty easily. Anyway, that's the end of that. I'll probably just do a little bit of a wrap-up episode after this to sort of talk about my final thoughts. It'll be short. Thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you guys for always showing up for all of these videos. It's always sort of sad when we finish a book, but also kind of exciting because that means we get to go on a new journey, and I'm looking forward to what we do next. I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.